I had been on the Vethsorel Plateau for 11 years before I found the creature in the rockfall, and I want to be clear from the start that I never went looking for it. You don't go looking for things on a high plateau in the Cordaorn Reach. The air is too thin for that kind of ambition. You walk your survey paths, you note what you find, you go back to the vault, and you log it, and the next morning you do it again. That is the whole of the work. That is, in fact, what I liked about it. My name is Bram Orville. I am 66 years old, and before I came to Vethsorel, I spent 22 years as a botanical field surveyor in the Cordaorn mountain systems mapping pollination corridors, tracking soil temperature gradients, noting which seed caches of which species survived which elevation winters. Not glamorous work. My supervisor at the Corda Institute, a woman named Sarah Fenn, who had been doing this longer than I had and showed no sign of stopping, once told me that the most important quality in a plateau surveyor was the ability to notice something, record it accurately, and not immediately conclude that you understood what it meant. I have tried to practice that my entire career. I think of it as the difference between observation and interpretation. Observation is your job. Interpretation is what you do carefully, later, with other data. I came to the seed vault posting at 65 because my knees had begun to object to full-season fieldwork, and because the Vethsorel posting had been vacant for 2 years and nobody else wanted it. The research station sits at 4,200 meters on the southern shelf of the plateau, a low stone building, insulated and heated, with the vault proper dug 12 meters below grade into the native rock. There is a communications array on the roof, a weather station, a small laboratory where I do germination tests, and a kitchen that is adequate. The plateau above the station is active survey terrain, not botanically complex, but the Cordaorn alpine flora has some interesting cold tolerance adaptations that the Institute tracks seasonally, and the survey paths cover about 14 kilometers of ground across the shelf and up into the lower rockfall zones. I walked them every morning that weather permitted. This was not strictly required by my posting. The vault work was the posting. The survey rounds were legacy protocol from the previous occupant, who had been a field botanist rather than a seed cataloguer. But I kept them up. I am 66 and my knees hurt, but I am not yet the kind of man who stops walking because walking has become optional. I note that for context. The rockfall above the station's northern survey path is geologically recent, a collapse of the eastern ridge face sometime in the last 2 centuries that left a field of granite blocks the size of small buildings stacked and slumped against the original cliff. The blocks are not stable in any reassuring way. The path that approaches them is the farthest from the station and the one I never extended beyond a fixed waypoint marker. Partly because there is nothing in the plant survey worth going further, and partly because of the noise the rockfall makes in high wind. It sounds, on certain mornings, as though it is still moving. It is not, I am told, actually still moving, but the sound is enough. I first noticed the creature on a Tuesday in late spring of my first year at the station. I want to be precise about what noticed means in this context. I was at the waypoint marker, taking a soil moisture reading, when I registered a smell that was not the normal suite of alpine rock and thin soil and whatever the wind was carrying down from the upper plateau. It was organic, warm, and large. I looked at the rockfall. I did not see anything. I logged it. Waypoint 7 organic scent, animal, large, direction approximately north-northwest, source not located, and I went back down. The following Thursday, there was blood on the rock face at the point where the lowest tier of the fall meets the survey path. Not a great quantity, but more than a bird. It had dried in the thin air to a dark rust color. I photographed it, logged it times waypoint 7, blood stain on lower rock face, approx. 0, 4M span, dried, source not located. Appears to predate this morning's round by 12 to 24 hours times and went back down. I did not step into the rockfall. This is relevant. On the second Friday of the following week, I brought a tin of water. This is going to sound either obvious or strange, depending on your frame. My frame was this. There was a large animal in the rockfall above the path. It was injured. The nearest source of running water was the snowmelt channel, 1,100 meters to the east, and the rockfall itself offered nothing. It was spring, but the plateau was still dry in the mornings before the afternoon thermals lifted moisture from the lower valleys. Whatever was in the rockfall was not moving much. The bloodstain had been there twice now, never in a new location, which suggested it wasn't foraging widely. An injured animal that isn't foraging widely either gets better in place or doesn't. I had a tin. I left it at the base of the first rock tier, at the edge of where the shadow fell, where something large could reach it without coming fully out into the open. I did not wait to see if anything drank from it. I went back down to the station and wrote in my survey log, Waypoint 7 deposited 1 water container, tin, 0, 8L, at base of lower rock tier. Grid reference WP7N, possible large injured raptor sheltering in rockfall. No direct observation. Will monitor. That was the log entry. I want you to hold it in your mind. Possible large injured raptor. I want you to understand that I was making a reasonable inference from available data. Large, yes. Injured, yes. Sheltering in elevated rocky terrain, yes. Not visible. Not willing to be seen, yes. Raptor was the closest zoological category I had. I am a botanist. I know plants. For animals, I work from general principles and inference. The inference was not unreasonable. The tin was empty the next morning. I left another one. This became, over the following weeks, a feature of the survey round. I would carry a tin up to waypoint 7, leave it at the base of the rock tier, collect the previous day's tin on my way out. The previous day's tin was always empty. Sometimes there were marks on the rock face, a drag of something large against the granite, but never in a position or at a scale I could reconcile with a raptor. I noted this in the log. I adjusted my entry from times possible large injured raptor times to times large sheltering animal, species unconfirmed, injury presumed from initial bloodstain, movement minimal. I did not adjust the conclusion. I had no other conclusion to adjust it to. There were other small signs across those first weeks. On the 7th day, a single large claw mark in the lower granite face, at a height no raptor could have made, about 2 meters above the path, and the marks were wide and spaced in a way that suggested significant body weight behind them. On the 14th day, I found a scale. A single scale. On the path just inside the waypoint marker, bronzed green, slightly curved at the edge, about the width of 3 fingers across. I picked it up and turned it in the light for a while, and then I put it in my survey pack and carried it back to the station. I photographed it and logged it. Scale, possibly draconic, single specimen, found WP, 7 lower path approach, dimensions 7.2 centimeters times 5.4 centimeters, pigment bronzed green with dark dorsal shading, undersurface pale copper. I put it on the windowsill above the laboratory worktop where the morning light caught it. And there it sat for the remainder of my first year, telling me what it knew. I kept leaving the water. The summer came, the plateau warmed, the survey paths opened up fully, and I expanded my morning rounds to cover the full 14-kilometer loop, which meant I was at waypoint 7 a little later each morning than I had been in the colder months. On one of those later mornings midsummer, the sun already well up. By the time I reached the rockfall, I stopped at the waypoint marker to take my reading and looked up into the rockfall, and for the first time, I saw it clearly. It was not a raptor. It was in the shadow of the 3rd rock tier, approximately 8 meters above the path. It was resting, the word I use now, but at the time I stood very still and had no word at all, only data arriving faster than I could organize it. The scale of it first, the way the shadow around it was occupied so fully that it took me a moment to understand where the shadow ended and the creature began. Then the texture, not feathers. Something ridged and scaled, a deep bronzed green that shaded to near black along the dorsal line, pale coppery at the underside of the jaw where the head was resting on a ledge of granite. The head itself angled toward the lower rockfall, which meant angled toward me. One eye visible, an eye that was not a raptor's eye. Large, slit-pupiled, amber with a ring of deeper color at the iris edge, and it was watching me with the particular quality of attention of something that had been watching me for a long time and had simply chosen this moment to stop pretending it wasn't. The left wing, I could see part of it where it was folded against the body, and part of it where it couldn't be folded properly anymore, because something had happened to the leading spar. It had healed wrong, or partly wrong. The membrane was intact, but the angle of the fold was off, and the muscle along the spar looked reduced in a way that suggested it had been reduced for some time. I stood at the waypoint marker and did not move. I was, at that moment, running the standard internal calculus of a person who has spent decades in rough terrain with large unknowns. How far is the path behind me? How open is the ground between me and it? Is there any behavior visible that signals aggression? The behavior visible was, it was lying down and looking at me. That was the whole of the behavior. Its jaw was on the granite ledge. Its eye was tracking me with what I can only call patience. I set the tin down at the base of the rock tier, exactly where I always left it. I said, out loud, because something about the moment required speech, "I'll see you tomorrow." I went back down to the station. I wrote in the log, Waypoint 7 direct observation of sheltering animal. Species, unknown. Scale, large adult, estimated 4 to 5 meters body length. Wingspan would be significant if functional left wing spar appears fused or malformed, movement compromised. Scales, bronzed green, dark dorsal, pale copper jaw and underside. Eyes, amber, slit pupil, bilateral right eye clear. Left eye partially clouded. Posture, resting. No aggression. Animal aware of observer. Tin left as normal. Entry amended. Large adult scaled animal. Presumed dragon type. Injured left wing. Sheltering Vethsoral rockfall above WP7. Will continue monitoring. I did not contact the Institute about this. I want to explain why, because I think it's relevant to everything that came after. I did not contact the Institute because I had no good data yet, and because the animal was clearly not interested in being discovered, and because in 22 years of field survey work, I had learned that the surest way to make an animal leave a location is to make that location interesting to people who didn't know about it before. It was there. It was injured. It was drinking the water I left. It was not bothering me or anything near the station. Reporting it would initiate a response chain Institute wildlife liaison, possibly regional authority notification, survey team to the plateau, and the response chain would arrive before I had anything useful to tell them, and the animal would leave, or try to leave. And injured animals that try to leave when they shouldn't sometimes die. So I kept leaving the water, and I kept writing times large adult scaled animal, species unconfirmed times in my log, and I did not report it. And I told myself this was sound professional judgment and not the behavior of a 66-year-old man who had found something he was not prepared to share yet. Both of those things were true. The second year was quieter than the first. I had stopped looking up into the rockfall when I left the tin, not because I was afraid of what I might see, but because the first direct observation had established something between us that I was reluctant to disrupt. He had chosen to let me see him. I filed that. I did not press it. I left the water, collected the empty tin, continued the survey round, went back to the vault. In my log, the entry evolved slowly over the months. The clouded left eye appeared in some observations to have cleared slightly at the margin. The posture on certain mornings was more elevated, the head up rather than resting, which I took to mean he was breathing more easily. Once, in early autumn, I looked up by instinct and found him standing fully upright on all 4 limbs at the 3rd tier. And the scale of him standing was so different from the scale of him resting that I stopped walking for a full minute before I remembered to close my mouth. He was very large. I want to be clear about this, because I think my log entries, which are calibrated for botanical survey and not for anything like this, may have understated it. 4 to 5 meters body length was the estimate I had written. Standing, with his neck extended and his head turned at an angle to catch the morning light, he was closer to 6. and broad through the chest in a way the resting posture had not communicated. The damaged wing was folded more fully than before, I noted, which was improvement, but even folded, the leading edge of it cleared the third rock tier. The right wing, which I had not seen fully extended before, was open to the sun in a manner that looked deliberate. The membrane was deep bronze, near translucent at the edges where the morning light came through. I left the tin. I said, "Good morning." He looked at me for a moment. Then he lowered himself back into the shadow of the third tier, and I did not see him again that day. I wrote in the log, WP7 animal observed standing, full assessment possible. Body length revised, est. 5.56 meters. Right wing observed partially extended, est. 7-8 meters span functional. Left wing, spar still malformed, but fold significantly improved versus 6 months prior, suggesting ongoing recovery. Left eye appears clearer at margin than previous observations. Right eye dominant, but left tracking movement. General condition, markedly improved from initial assessment. Animal ambulatory. No aggression noted. Tin left as usual. I paused before I closed the log, and then I added, recovery appears genuine. This may resolve itself without intervention. Continue to monitor. What I meant by this, I didn't examine too carefully. I knew what I meant. I meant, he might be well enough to leave soon, and when he left, I would stop leaving the water, and the entry in the log would close, and the survey round would go back to being a survey round. I knew, without quite deciding to know, that I was not looking forward to that. The 12th day of the following April, late spring, second year, I arrived at waypoint 7 at the normal hour and found the tin from the previous day untouched. The water in it had frozen overnight and thawed again in the morning, and it was sitting exactly where I had left it, full. I stood at the marker and looked at it for a moment. Then I looked up into the rockfall. I could not see him. I left the new tin, took the old one, and went back to the station. I told myself, he moved. The recovery progressed to the point where he could leave the immediate area to forage or find water on his own. This is good. This is what recovery looks like. The following morning, the tin was full again, and the morning after that. On the 4th morning, I climbed into the rockfall. I want to be clear that I am not someone who climbs into rockfall. I am 66, my knees are bad, and the lower rock tier of the Vethsorol collapse is made of granite blocks ranging from large boulder to small house scale, with gaps between them that are interesting from a structural stability standpoint in exactly the way I do not enjoy. I brought a pole. I wore my survey pack with the emergency kit. I told myself I was going to determine whether the animal had left the area, and if it had, I would note the departure and close the entry. I found him on the 4th tier up, in a section of the fall I had not been able to see from the path. He was on his side. This was the part that made me stop climbing and simply stare for a moment, because in 2 years of observation I had never seen him on his side. He was breathing. I could see that from the rise and fall of the rib cage, but the breathing was labored, and the sound it made in the enclosed space of the rock channel was wrong. A wet sound. A sound that belongs to respiratory distress. His right eye found me. He had not moved his head. He tracked me with that eye, and I had the impression, standing on the uneven granite with my pole and my pack and my 66-year-old knees, that he was watching me with the same quality of patience he had shown from the 3rd tier on the first morning I'd seen him clearly, but that the patience now was a different kind. Not the patience of an animal choosing whether to reveal itself. The patience of something that had been waiting to see if help was coming and had not quite given up on the waiting. I said, "All right." I climbed the rest of the way up. The respiratory distress, as best I could assess it with a botanist's medical knowledge and a survey emergency kit, was infection. There was something going on in the left side of the chest. I could hear it when I pressed my ear to the scale plates along his flank, which I did without letting myself think about doing it. Because if I had thought about it, I might not have done it. A wet crackling underneath the breathing. Too much fluid in there. Or the start of too much fluid. His temperature was elevated. I could feel it through the scales where I had my hand. The damaged wing was pressed against the rock face on the downside, And when I looked at where the fused spar met the shoulder joint, I found an area of inflammation that the fold had been concealing, swollen, warm. The scale plates along the joint lifted slightly. I had, in my survey emergency kit, a folding blanket, a signaling device, wound sealant, a splint kit for human scale injuries, water purification tablets, 2 days of ration bars, a small medical kit with antiseptic, wound dressing, and a general-purpose antibiotic formulation designed for field use in the cordyceps range, the kind that covers broad-spectrum bacterial infection in the local fauna, which runs to some fairly large species in the high valleys. I do not know if it was the right thing. I want to be clear that I was operating at the outer edge of my competence. I assessed as carefully as I could. The inflammation at the wing joint was the most visually alarming. The scale plates there had a distinct heat to them, and the tissue beneath was swollen enough that the joint could not articulate naturally. But the respiratory problem was what frightened me more. Infection that moves into the chest becomes something else in time, and I didn't have time to be conservative. I crouched beside the wing joint and pressed my hand flat against the scales above the inflammation. He did not move. His eye tracked down to my hand and held there. I said, "I'm going to clean this. I don't know if it will help, but I'm going to do it." His eye came back to my face. I cleaned the joint as well as I could with the antiseptic. It took longer than I expected. The scale plates along the upper margin of the inflammation were partially lifted, and I had to work carefully around them because I did not know what was normal tissue and what was damaged, and I did not want to do more harm than I had already possibly done by attempting this at all. I applied wound dressing to the worst of the inflamed area and held it in place with strips of adhesive from the kit, working the adhesive strips between the scale plate edges where they would hold. The scale plates were not as rigid as I had imagined. They had a small amount of flex, enough that they accommodated the dressing without lifting further, which I logged internally as useful information without knowing what I would ever do with it. The antibiotic formulation I dissolved in water. I had brought 2 tins, my own supply from the station, and I offered him the water with the formulation in it first. He drank. Not all of it. There was a caution in the way he drank that I interpreted as deliberate. He was not sure what I had put in the water, and he was tasting before committing, and then he committed. I don't know how much of it was beneficial. I don't know if the dosage was anywhere near correct for something his size. I know he drank it, and I know he was still alive 12 days later, and I know the wet crackling in his chest was quieter on day 3 than it had been on day 1. Because I stayed. That is the part I have not said yet. I stayed in the rockfall for 12 days. I sent a maintenance message to the Institute on day 1, the automated survey log update that went out every 72 hours, flagging that I would be conducting an extended waypoint assessment and would update on day 5. I then did not think about the Institute again. I set up the folding blanket as insulation against the granite, working it between 2 of the lower tier blocks to create a windbreak on the north face, and I rationed my food supply. And I went back to the station twice for water and additional supplies when I calculated I could make the round trip safely. The round trip was 40 minutes each way with bad knees on granite, and I made it 4 times before I stopped counting, and I did not leave him for more than 2 hours at any point across those 12 days. The first 2 days were the worst. I did not know if the antibiotic was helping. I did not know if the infection was moving or holding. I kept my hand on the flank scales where I could feel the temperature, and I tracked it as best I could, warmer in the afternoon of day 1, cooler toward the evening of day 2, stable on day 3, and then on day 4, definitely cooler than it had been, which was the first thing I had to be pleased about. The wet sound in his chest cycled, worse in the cold mornings, better after the plateau warmed. I noted the pattern and adjusted accordingly, which meant being awake in the coldest hours of the pre-dawn to monitor the breathing, and sleeping in the warmer midday hours when the rockfall held the sun and his respiratory rate settled. I talked to him. I want to acknowledge that this happened because I think it matters and because I am trying to be accurate. I am not someone who talks to animals. I matterly. I matter. 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 I am someone who notes their presence in survey logs and does not anthropomorphize. But I was in a rockfall for 12 days with a dragon who was very ill and could not move, and there are only so many hours of silence that it makes sense to maintain. And the silence of a sick animal in the pre-dawn hours is a particular kind of heavy that I found I could not simply sit inside without responding to. I talked to him about the survey data, what I had logged that season, the soil temperature readings, a cold tolerance adaptation in the Veth-Sorrel alpine sedge that I found interesting, a discrepancy in the pollination corridor mapping I had been trying to resolve for 3 years. I talked about the seed vault and what was in it, the catalog sections I had been working through, the gaps in the record from a previous cataloger who had left their filing in a state I still hadn't fully reconciled, a batch of high-altitude samples from 30 years prior whose provenance notes were incomplete. Small things. The texture of the daily work, which was the texture of my life on the plateau, and which I found, speaking it aloud in the cold dark of the rockfall, was surprisingly sufficient as a life. I had not always known that. I talked, on the 6th day, about my wife, Dara, who had died 8 years earlier of a cardiac event on a field assignment in the lower Cordovel range. She had been a plant ecologist, better than me in the field, faster on difficult terrain despite being 2 years older. She had known, in the way that some people know things about plants, when something was wrong, before the data confirmed it. She called it listening to the baseline. And I had always been slightly envious of it because I had to derive what she just heard. She would have been better at the 12 days in the rockfall than I was. She would have known what to do earlier, and doubted it less. I still expected to see her when I came back inside from the morning rounds. After 8 years, this had not stopped being true. I talked, on the 9th day, about why I had come to the Veth-Sorrel posting, which was not only my knees, but the fact that I had not known, after Dara died, how to be in any place where there were other people who knew she was gone, and the plateau was very high and very empty, and that had seemed, at the time, like the thing I needed, the silence, the altitude. The daily work of noting what you find, and not immediately concluding you understand what it means. I had needed a place where I could simply be the botanist again without being also the widower, and Veth-Sorrel had provided it, and I was grateful. I said this, out loud, in a rockfall, to a dragon. I do not think I would have said it to anyone else. He listened. I don't know what else to call it. His eye tracked me, and on the occasions when I paused or went quiet, he would make the subvocal resonance, not the acknowledgement pulse, something softer, something I interpreted as a prompt to continue, though I acknowledge I may have been interpreting too generously. His breathing on the 7th day stopped making the wet sound entirely. On the 8th day, his temperature, measured by hand against the flank scales, felt normal in a way I couldn't define precisely, but had enough experience now to trust. On the 10th day, he lifted his head and held it up for the first time since I had found him on his side. I said, "Good." He made the soft resonance. I said, "Don't rush it." And then, because it seemed true and I might as well say it, "You have time." On the 12th day, he turned over. It was not a smooth process. It took most of an hour, and it was not quiet, and twice I had to move out of the way quickly for a man with bad knees on uneven granite, which I managed without embarrassing myself. But he got himself upright, all 4 limbs under him, head up, and he held that position. And then he turned his head and looked at me directly for the first time since the morning at the 3rd tier. Both eyes. The right, clear and amber. The left, still clouded at the outer zone, but tracking now with the right. I said, "There you go." He made a sound. I don't have good language for it. It was subvocal, a resonance more felt than heard, and it moved through the granite under my feet. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't frightened. I wrote this in my log that evening when I got back to the station, and I stand by the entry. It was acknowledgement. The specific quality of a sound made by one party in the presence of another to confirm that the other party is registered and known. I went back to the station. I ate the first hot meal I'd had in 12 days. I sent the Institute the waypoint assessment update routine. No flags, and then I opened the survey log and wrote the day's entry. WP7 animal upright, both eyes tracking, respiration clear, joint inflammation reduced approximately 70%, temperature normalized, estimated, antibiotic course complete. Animal appears stable, continuing to monitor. Tin left as normal. I read it back. I almost added something. Then I closed the log and went to bed. For the next 3 weeks, the survey round was quiet. He was back in his resting position on the 3rd tier when I arrived each morning. But the position was different now, more upright, head up. Not the deep resting on the ledge posture of the 1st year. He was watching the plateau. On the 5th day after I returned from the rockfall, when I left the tin and turned to go, he made the sound again, the sub-vocal resonance through the rock. I stopped walking. I turned back. He was looking at me. I nodded, which is a ridiculous thing to do, and I went back to the station. I started leaving 2 tins. On the 17th day after my return, I reached waypoint 7 in the early morning and found the tin from the previous day empty and set not tipped, not displaced, but set at the base of the rock tier in a position that was not the position in which I had left it. It had been moved about 60 centimeters to the left of where I had placed it, and it was positioned with the open end toward the survey path. I looked at this for a moment. I looked up into the rockfall, where he was on the 3rd tier, watching. Then I looked back at the tin. I wrote in the log, WP, 7 tin, repositioned, source, presumed animal, manner, deliberate open end, toward path, placed, not tipped. No other notable observations. I paused, and then I added, noted. Noted. 2 days later, a second tin appeared at the base of the rock tier. It was not one of mine. It was of a different material, something that caught the morning light with a faint iridescence, slightly larger than my standard survey tins, and there was something inside it. I crouched down and looked. It was seeds. A small quantity of seeds I didn't recognize, small, dark, slightly flattened, with a waxy coating that was unusual for any of the Cordoorn alpine species I knew. I picked it up carefully. I carried it back to the station. I examined the seeds under the laboratory scope and wrote 3 pages of notes on them and sent, for the first time since I'd found him, an actual non-routine message to the Institute. I described the seeds. I did not describe where I'd found them. The Institute replied 3 days later. The duty botanist who answered had run the morphology against the full Cordoorn alpine database and several of the off-world databases the Institute maintained for comparative xenobotany work. No match. The waxy coating was consistent with seeds adapted for very high altitude dispersal, higher than Veth Soral, potentially significantly higher, and the flattened shape suggested adaptation for transport in dense feather or scale coverage. The seeds appeared viable. The duty botanist wanted to know where I'd collected them. I replied that I'd found them in transit from the upper plateau, likely windborne, and that I was attempting to locate the source species. This was not entirely a lie. I went back to waypoint 7 the following morning with the seed tin, both of them, his and mine, and set his at the base of the rock tier. And when I looked up into the rockfall, he was there on the 3rd tier, and I held up the tin and said, "Where do these come from?" He looked at me for a long time. Then he looked at the upper plateau, across the shelf, toward the high cliff face on the northern edge where the rockfall had originally collapsed from. I looked at the cliff face. I looked back at him. I said, "High up then." I wrote in the log, "Seeds of unknown alpine species received, may be from upper plateau origin above current survey boundary. Not a native Cordoorn species, possibly a relict or introduced population in the high cliff habitats above WP7, noted for future investigation." I kept the seeds in the laboratory. They were the first thing I had ever received from a survey site that I hadn't been the one to put there. 31 days after the morning I'd found him on his side. I was making the morning survey round in a moderate east wind, the kind that sometimes carries ice crystals from the upper reaches down to the shelf when I came over the last rise before the waypoint marker and stopped. There were 3 of them on the plateau. Not in the rockfall, on the plateau itself, on the open ground of the upper shelf, south of the waypoint marker. 3 dragons. Full size, one significantly larger than the other 2, a deep bronze-red female with gold-tipped scale plates along the neck and jaw, and eyes that were a clear, pale amber, the color of very old resin. The other 2 flanked her, one rust-red and compact, with a bearing that I would have called military in a human, and one slate gray with distinctive white scale markings along the shoulder lines that I hadn't seen in any of the rockfall observations. They were looking at the station. They were looking at me. I stopped walking. My first thought, and I want to acknowledge this, because I think it tells you something about 11 years on a high plateau, was, I should log this. My second thought was that the bronze-red female was approximately twice the size of the dragon in the rockfall, and that the size differential was not, in the cold morning air on an empty shelf of granite, a comfortable thing to register. My third thought was, he sent for them, or they found him, or he found them. I didn't know which. B. I didn't know which, but the mathematics were simple enough. There were 3 dragons on the plateau above my station, and there was 1 dragon in the rockfall I had been leaving water for, and those 2 facts were connected in a way that was now my immediate problem. The bronze-red female looked at me. She did not approach. She simply looked, with the particular quality of attention I had by now become familiar with, total, patient, calibrating. I walked forward to the waypoint marker and set the tin down at the base of the rock tier. I collected the empty tin from the previous day. I straightened up and looked at the 3 dragons on the shelf and said, at a volume appropriate to the distance, "Good morning." The rust-red one on the left tilted his head. The bronze-red female was still looking at me. A sound came from the rockfall above the subvocal resonance, deep and felt through rock, and this time it did not stop at 1 pulse. It continued in a pattern that I can't reproduce in text because it was not language in any form I have. But I registered it, and something in me, not the botanist, something older understood that it was about me. The bronze-red female turned her head toward the rockfall. She was silent for a moment. Then she turned back to me. She was closer than I had realized. She had crossed the distance from the south of the waypoint marker to a position approximately 4 meters from me while I was watching the rockfall, and I had not seen her move. She was very large, and the pale amber of her eyes had a quality of depth to them that I found, standing there with an empty tin in my hand, genuinely difficult to look away from. She spoke. It was not the resonance through rock. It was vocalized consonants, some quality in the high register that I could feel at the back of my inner ear, and it was directed at me. I didn't understand it. My face must have communicated this, because she paused, tilted her head very slightly, the same gesture the rust-red one had made, but with more weight behind it, and spoke again. Different words, the same directed quality. I said, I don't speak your language. I'm sorry. Fine. Another pause. Then she made a third vocalization, and this one was followed immediately by the same sound from the rockfall, his resonance, rising, a kind of affirmation. And then from the rockfall came something that was neither the subvocal resonance nor the vocalized speech of the bronze-red female, but something between them, and in that something, after a moment, I heard a word I recognized. My name, or close enough to my name that I recognized it. Bram, the Vethsorel rockfall, in the thin morning air of the plateau, had just said my name. I turned and looked up into the rockfall. He was at the 2nd tier, now lower than I had seen him in months, and he was looking at me with both eyes, and his posture was not the resting posture, and it was not the standing posture, but something I had not seen before, which I can only describe as deliberate presentation. A stillness that was chosen, a visibility that was chosen. I said, I hear you. The bronze-red female spoke again. This time, her vocalization included something that sounded like my name in the middle of it times Bram, times at the same pitch and register that had come from the rockfall. She was learning it. She had heard it once and incorporated it. I noted this the way I note most things. Observed. Logged. Significance pending. She then produced a sound I can only describe as a question. The shape of it, the rising terminal, was not so different from a question in any human language, and it was directed at me, and it was accompanied by a gesture. One foreclaw, extended and then turned. Palm upward. Toward the rockfall. I understood this. She was asking, why? I looked at the extended foreclaw. I looked at the rockfall. I looked back at her eyes, which were waiting with a patience I had learned to read over 2 years of morning rounds, and I said what was true, because there was nothing else to say. He was thirsty, and then he was sick, and there wasn't anyone else up here. She held my gaze for a moment. The foreclaw lowered. From the rockfall came the sub-vocal resonance again, longer this time, and when it ended, the bronze-red female closed her eyes briefly 1 second. 2. And when she opened them, something had changed in her bearing. Not smaller, not less. Something settled. Like a question she had been holding for a long time had found its answer, and she was adjusting herself to the weight of it. The rust-red one and the slate-gray one, who had held their positions on the shelf throughout this exchange, moved now not toward me, but toward each other. And the body language between them was not aggressive, not alarmed, but the particular quality of shared acknowledgement between two people who have reached the same conclusion at the same time. The bronze-red female spoke to the rockfall, long, complex, the vowels carrying a weight I couldn't parse but could feel. The rockfall was silent for a moment. Then the resonance came back, and in it was my name again, and the word that preceded it I heard it 4 times across the subsequent minutes, each time differently framed, but consistent. Keth Bram. I said, I don't know what that means. The bronze-red female looked at me. She raised her head not threateningly, but in the manner of someone gathering themselves to say something important, and she produced a vocalization that was slower and more deliberate than anything she had said before. She held eye contact throughout it. And then, at the end, with the precision of someone who has learned a word and wants to be sure it lands correctly, she said, You kept the fire. Her accent was extraordinary. The words were clearly effortful, shaped carefully, each one, but they were words, and they were mine, and they were correct. I said, Yes, I suppose I did. I do. She lowered her head. Not all the way, not the way the rockfall had rested his jaw on the granite in the first year. Halfway. A measured, deliberate angle. The rust-red one and the slate-gray one did the same, simultaneously, as though they had been waiting for the signal. I stood at waypoint 7 with an empty tin in my hand while 3 dragons bowed to me on the Vethsorel plateau, and I want to be honest about what I felt. I felt, primarily, that I wanted to sit down. The knees. But underneath that, at a depth I didn't have good language for in the moment, I felt something that was less like pride and more like relief. As if a thing I had not known I was worried about had been resolved. As if the 2 years of survey log entries and early mornings and 12 days in the rockfall had been a question, and the question had just been answered, and the answer was, yes, it was enough. You did enough. The small, unremarkable thing you did was enough. From the rockfall came the resonance again, and this time it was not my name and it was not times Keth Bram times, but something longer and more complex. And the bronze-red female lifted her head and responded with something complex of her own, and the exchange continued for several minutes with the two of them. And I stood at the waypoint marker and did not try to follow it. It was not mine to follow. What I could follow was this. He was coming down, slowly, with the particular care of something that had not moved far from a single location in 2 years. He was making his way down through the rock tiers, second to first. The damaged wing was folded as tightly as it could fold, better than it had been, but still not fully right. His movement was careful and deliberate, and he was not looking at the footing. which on the uneven granite was actually the correct choice. He was looking at the bronze-red female, and she was looking back. And the quality of that looking was one I knew how to recognize without knowing how to name. He reached the base of the first tier and stopped. We were approximately the same level now, me on the path, him at the rock base, and he was much larger at this proximity than he had been at any of the distances I had observed from. 6 meters of body, and the head well above mine, and the scale plates along his jaw were the pale copper I had noted in the first summer, and the right eye was the amber I knew. And the left eye was clearer than it had been in April, clearer than I had dared hope it would ever be. He looked at me. I said, "Good morning." He made the resonant sound. Once, brief, an answer. Then he turned to the bronze-red female, and something passed between them, a long exchange, mostly silence, the kind of silence that is its own form of communication, and then he turned back to me. He lowered his head. All the way, the full measure of it. Jaw not quite to the rock this time, but close, a formal angle, held for several seconds, which I understood without being told was a different gesture from the bronze-red female's partial bow, more personal, longer held. I nodded. Ridiculous, again. But I meant it. The bronze-red female spoke to me one more time. She produced 3 sounds, and then the word she had said before, times Kethbram, times, and then one more sound, and she looked at me to see if I had understood. I hadn't. I shook my head. She was quiet for a moment. Then she tried again, this time with the Corda Orn basic register inflection that I recognized as an attempt to put an alien phoneme into a form a human ear could parse, and what came out was, Kethbram, the one who kept the fire when the fire did not know it was going out. I said, he knew. She tilted her head. I said, he knew. He was watching me the whole time. He let me see him. He left the seeds. He knew more than I did about most of it. I paused. I just kept showing up. The bronze-red female was quiet for a long moment. I had the impression she was translating not my words, which I think she had followed, but the implication of them. The thing I was saying underneath the thing I was saying, that the credit she was extending was in the wrong direction, or was at minimum being distributed incorrectly. That the 2 years of water leaving had not been a strategy. It had simply been the next morning, and then the next morning after that. She made a sound that was short and soft, and somehow warm. Not a laugh exactly, but close enough to the shape of one that I registered it as one. She said, yes, that is what it means. I did not understand immediately. Then I did. Kethbram, the one who kept the fire when the fire did not know it was going out. She was not telling me what I had done. She was telling me what the name meant, and the name included both parts, the fire not knowing and the keeping continuing anyway. The unremarkable persistence was not incidental to the name. It was the name. I stood at waypoint 7 and held that thought for a moment, and then I said, all right. She lowered her head the partial distance again, the formal measure. And then she spoke once more, and this time it was to the rockfall, and long, and I could hear in the shape of it something that was not a report and not a command, but something in between. The way you speak to someone when you are telling them what you found, and letting them decide what to do with it. They left on the 3rd day. Not in a rush, not urgently. The bronze-red female and her 2 companions held the plateau for that full time, and I found I did not mind their presence the way I might have minded most unexpected visitors. They were quiet. They kept to the upper shelf, and did not approach the station directly except once, on the afternoon of the first day, when the rust-red one walked the full length of the waypoint path, from the marker to the base of the rock tier and back, slowly, at a pace that I understood was deliberate inspection. He did not touch anything. He came back to the shelf and reported to the bronze-red female, and I went back to the laboratory and did not watch the rest of whatever that exchange was. On the 2nd day, a 4th dragon arrived, very old, moving slowly, who did not stay long but who spent approximately an hour in the rockfall, and then came down and stood on the plateau and looked at the station from a distance. And I had the impression of something being assessed and found adequate, though I couldn't have said what or by what standard. He was pale bronze, and very large, larger than the bronze-red female, Though his age was in the movement, the careful placement of weight, the economy of posture that belongs to old creatures and old people alike. He looked at the station. He looked at me, where I was standing at the laboratory window watching him. Then he turned away. I went back to the germination test. He, the dragon from the rockfall, Kethbram's reason for being left with them on the morning of the third day. He came down to the base of the rock tier one final time before they departed, and I was there at the waypoint marker, as I was every morning, with the tin. I set it down. He looked at it. He looked at me. He did not drink from it. I understood this too. I picked it up. He made the resonant sound the acknowledgement sound, the one I had catalogued as times registered and known times, and then he turned and walked to where the bronze-red female was waiting on the open shelf, and she fell in beside him, and the rust-red and the slate-gray arranged themselves, and the old one who had arrived on the second day was already aloft, circling slowly above the plateau on the morning thermals. I watched them go. It took a while. The damaged wing worked as well as it was going to work, which was well enough. When the last of them had cleared the upper cliff line, and the plateau was empty, and the east wind was the only sound, I walked back to the station. I put the kettle on. I opened the survey log. I wrote, WP7 sheltering animal departed this morning with 4 companions, direction northeast, total period of observation, 2 years, 3 months, 12 days. Animal healthy at departure, left wing spar, functional, limited, left eye, approximately 80% recovered, condition, stable. I stopped and thought for a moment, and then I added, seeds retained in laboratory, viable, source species, unknown, upper plateau origin suspected, will continue to investigate. I poured my tea. I had, on the worktop beside the kettle, a small collection of things that had accumulated over 2 years. The iridescent tin he had left me, the seeds inside it now transferred to labeled sample vials, and a single scale plate the size of my palm, bronzed green, slightly curved that I had found on the rockfall path on the 6th morning of the 12 days. I had not put it there. I had not put any of it there. I looked at the scale plate for a moment. Then I picked it up and put it in the pocket of my survey jacket, where it was warm from sitting in the morning sun, and I went out to start the daily round. The plateau was very empty and very quiet. The east wind had died. There was nothing at waypoint 7, and the rockfall was just rock. I took the soil moisture reading. I noted the sedge distribution along the path edge, which had spread about 30 centimeters north since the previous week. I wrote it all down. On the way back, I stopped at the waypoint marker one more time. I stood there for a while, not doing anything in particular, just standing in the thin air of the Veth-Sorrel shelf with the granite and the sky and the wind coming up from the lower valleys. The upper plateau caught the mid-morning light and held it in a way I had always found good to look at. Every piece of rock distinct, every shadow clean-edged, the whole place honest about what it was. I thought about what the bronze-red female had said, and about what I had said in return times. I just kept showing up times, and I thought that was still the most accurate thing I could have said. I had shown up, every morning, in weather and not weather, with the tin, and the botanical data, and eventually, the conversation. I had not known what I was doing it for. I had not known, most of the time, whether it was helping. I had done it because it was the next right small thing, and the thing after that was the same thing, and the thing after that. 66 years old, 11 years on a high plateau, 22 years before that in the field, noting what I found and not immediately concluding I understood what it meant. I turned back toward the station. The vault work wouldn't do itself. The seeds in the laboratory were still unclassified, which was an oversight I intended to correct, and there was a germination test scheduled for Thursday that I was genuinely curious about. The plateau would be here tomorrow. It would be here for a long time after tomorrow. I went inside and started on the morning's work.